to offer an encouraging word. So maybe those are some of the descriptors that you would also use if somebody came to your mind. So knowing a bit about them and the lives that they had lived and the things that they had lived through, I knew that who they were today didn't just happen overnight. Both victories and defeats, mountains and valleys, internal work and outside influences, all the things shaped them. But that's the thing. Similar to what Jim said this morning about abandonment. They were still moldable by God. I think this is one of those culture qualities of this church that I love so much, that we are still to this day being shaped by Him. I was reading this week about the span of time between when a seed is planted and the fruit is produced. It's during this time in our own journeys that the enemy seems to attack. The amount of fruit in our life, like patience, doesn't just happen. The adversity, the attacks from predators and pests, the unexpected weather pattern, and the list goes on. The adversity that we face while we are still growing impacts the plant, which is us, and the fruit, which could be inner peace and the outward expressions of that. Most of us aren't being grown in a controlled environment, greenhouse, right? We're outside in the elements. But when we slow down to notice God, when we slow down to even notice nature, when we slow down to look at ourselves honestly in the mirror, we begin to find opportunities to tend to and cultivate growth in our life. And so as we head into this time of prayer and fasting during Lent, there's an invitation to each of us to draw closer to our Father and to recognize how close He is to us. I heard someone say that Lent is holy interruption into our otherwise consumed days. It's an opportunity to cultivate whatever it is that God might be inviting you into in these next 40 days. For us here in Nebraska, coming out of winter, there's a great expectancy when we can finally get outside and begin turning over the soil, preparing the ground for what is to grow the remainder of the year. This is that time for us in our spiritual journeys as well. What may have laid dormant or fallow for a season is ready for the gardener's hands to begin activity once again. So, different question. I'm going to flip it around here. A show of hands, who has not experienced fear at some point in their life? Rather than we all raising our hands for fear, right? We don't want to do that. All right, nobody, right? We've all experienced fear. Now, on the screen, I went with some nice stuffed versions of the two common fears that some people have, because I didn't want to cause any adverse reactions this morning. So these are cute and cuddly, right? Who wouldn't want a stuffed spider and a stuffed snake, right? So everything from fear of spiders and snakes to fear of maybe bridges and crowds to fear of man. I know a thing or two about that last one. Only in hindsight did I realize that's what it was, as I realized how alone and isolated, self-protecting and suffocated I was. Only recognizing it because I was able to breathe free and deep and fresh again. Sometimes fear can trigger a fight or flight response, which I think we've maybe have experienced, where rational thought tends to go out the window. But there's times where fear can be more subtle or creep in slowly. Snakes and spiders might induce fight or flight, as survival is at stake. But subtly, or a progression, might look like this. A number of years ago, when our older two were probably 9 and 10 years old, we went to Silver Dollar City down in Branson. Anybody been to Silver Dollar City? few folks, most folks, okay? They had a Viking ship ride that swung on a pendulum, right? Back and forth. But this was one of those standing seat type ones where the U-shaped harness comes down over you and you're kind of just hanging there. So Brogan wanted to go on this ride. It was his first big ride. So even though, he was about the right height for it, if you knew him at that age, he was more like one of the speaker stands where he was all head and no body, right? It was just skinny. Glad he's not here to. Yeah. So even for him at that age, it was about higher, faster, let's push the limits. And as you know, he's studying to become a pilot now. So there was a little bit, or maybe much, apprehension on our part as he hadn't been on something this big before. And so did they really figure, weight and size, or was it just height? And so once we were on the ride, apprehension gradually formed into fear. And as the ship began to move front to back, higher and more pronounced with each pass by the center point, it became increasingly clear that this was not a good idea. And as we reached the point where gravity was no longer what kept you in your seat, but the harness alone, this scrawny 8-year-old started to slip through the padded harness. We reached our hands across him the best that we could, because we ourselves were also harnessed in, and rational thought disappeared as the possibilities of what might happen came into view. Thoughts of amusement park accidents, sounds of change and keys and sunglasses as they hit the concrete below. Are we on the verge of life and death right now? Control was out of reach as I grasped into thin air, only to find helplessness. Well, we obviously made it through, and now, like I said, he's flying airplanes. But fear often enters when we feel a lack of control in a situation, when outside forces seem to have the upper hand, when something or someone else is dictating what the end result should look like, be, or do. If not in fight or flight, we can feel helpless. There's an interesting thing that happens when we replace the verb grasp with give. As we move from a physical situation into the spiritual context of it and invite God into it. Seemingly impossible to do on a Viking ship 40 feet above dry land. But when we give him control, instead of grasping for our own control, we can experience resolve. This is that moment where God's perfect love comes in and drives out the fear. It's knowing that his promises are true, that I am safe in his arms, that my loved ones are safe in his arms, regardless of my perception and seeming reality. It's out of my control anyway, so my only choice is to give it to him. It's saying, God, you got this, regardless of what I think the outcome will most likely be. Some situations, like I said, are much more subtle, where fear enslaves in the absence of chains. This is especially true when we talk about the fear of man. It can creep in or start with small compromises. It has a way of closing in around us. Sometimes it's only a whisper. Be careful. Stay small. Don't rock the boat. But one day you wake up and you realize you have lost who you are and you can't breathe. So how do we step out of fear and into hope? This morning, we're going to step into a series titled Out of Egypt in the book of Exodus, which will take us through to Easter. So in the book of Exodus, we see Israel, God's people. We're stepping out of many different things, including fear, and stepping into the promised land. So for us, ahead of Easter, the cross, salvation, we're going to parallel the Israelites' journey as we look at our own lives, as we step out of our old self, Egypt, and into the kingdom, our new creation, Jesus, and the promised land. So this morning, we're going to step out of fear and into hope. So this is a good opportunity, if you haven't done so in a while, to read through the book of Exodus. Not just as a story, but as a parallel to your own journey. Noticing the world of that present day and that of today. So last week, Nikki left off at the end of Genesis, and so we're going to pick up in Exodus 1 this week. So the first 7 verses. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. I think an important note here is that names matter to God. We see this all throughout Scripture. I know sometimes we get hung up in certain parts of the Bible as we look at all the genealogies, right? But it's apparent that names mean something to God, especially seen in the stories where God changes people's names as they step into their calling. Even when the world might forget, God remembers, and He knows each of us by name. So we see that Israel continues to multiply, and God's faithfulness to Abraham of His promise generations prior continue to unfold. When God speaks, He is faithful to complete it. And it can be for the next generations, not always the next day. But now we see the scene quickly change in verse 8. Then a new king, who did not know about Joseph, came to power in Egypt. "Look," he said to his people, "the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with hard labor in brick and mortar, and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their hard labor, the Egyptians used them ruthlessly. So we see a ruler with no memory, no gratitude, no sense of shared story, no awareness of a plan bigger than himself. And fear takes hold. Irrational thought comes in. Fear leads to other words that we see in this passage of slaves and slave masters, oppression, dread, ruthless, bitter, harsh. But there's an irony in this story of fear-driven power. The more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. Oops, that backfired. Maybe you've noticed this, but fear always overplays its hand and never accomplishes what it promises. The more we try to control the narrative, it seems like the worse things seem to get. So now, Pharaoh shifts his tactics. And again, we see that names are important as God remembers these two midwives, these middle managers these ushers of new life, these women of peace. Verse 15, the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you help the Hebrew women in childbirth and observe them on the delivery stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? The midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people, every boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. I find it interesting that Pharaoh tries to enlist the help from those within God's people. He had to have recognized that power differential and thought, well, maybe I can tap into it and have a way in. I can destroy from the inside out. Quite a tactic. These two women, though, chose obedience over controlling their own safety. They showed courage in the face of fear, not necessarily in a loud rebellion or dramatic event, but in a quiet, holy resistance, where they chose to not comply with something that violates God's heart. They chose to fear God over man, and God's love is ushered in. Like our word for the year, steady on. Continue doing what the Lord has called us to do, ushering new life into the world, staying close to God's heart, loving others well. Whenever God is birthing something new, the world will try to limit it. In Pharaoh's words, if it's a boy, kill it. If it threatens power, destroy it early. And that pattern hasn't gone away, even to this day. Whenever God breathes new life into a calling, a church, a family, a heart, the world says that it has to look a certain way or serve a certain purpose. It has to stay manageable. It has to serve me. But under God's rule, new life is never self-serving because it exists to serve him. So God was kind to the midwives. God always notices courage that fear tries to hide. This reverence for God should guide our decisions, especially when human commands conflict with divine purpose. Their reverence for God led to his favor and blessing. These women were faithful through a simple refusal to comply. They weren't prophets or preach sermons or part the seas. They simply refused to participate in death. Shiphrah and Puah said yes to God and played a crucial role in God's redemptive history. Never underestimate what God can do with obedience that feels small. Because of their obedience, in the very next chapter, we see the birth of Moses and his life being saved. The one who will lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Exodus 2 begins with a mother hiding her baby, a sister standing watch, and a basket placed in the Nile, the very place Pharaoh intended for death. And irony strikes again. Pharaoh's own daughter draws Moses out of the water. Fear said, throw them into the river. God said, I'll raise a deliverer from it. God turns an instrument of death into a pathway of deliverance. And just like in Genesis, this story points forward. Another child would be born under an empire gripped by fear. Another ruler would try to eliminate life to protect power. And once again, God would bring deliverance, not through force, but through faithfulness. A simple yes to God holds a deep power to save. So here's a few questions for us today. When fear says one thing, when the world says one thing, what does God say? Where do you need hope this morning? What might God be birthing that needs your courage? Sometimes the most faithful thing we can do is simply refuse to let fear decide for us. Other women who don't let fear decide are seen throughout Scripture. Several Marys, Deborah, Esther, Ruth, Rahab, Priscilla, and the list goes on. God's heart for his people and deliverance is witnessed through these women who bear God's image, carry his authority, and have the strength to deliver. I love the Father's heart displayed through women of faith. Courage, resilience, compassion, moral integrity, holy strength, tenacity, passion. But let's face it, there's many women who live in fear, and they need hope. Parts of the world and even parts of the Big C Church believe that women should be silent, or they can't be elders or pastors, or insert any limitation here. But if we reduce women like Shiphrah and Puah to the two midwives, if we take away their name, their honor, their voice, we contradict the very heart of Scripture, and we blur the image of God on earth. If we take the posture that only God uses men in certain functions, we miss a vital expression of his kingdom. And it's not because no man was available. The God who parts seas and raises the dead, he's not limited to casting choices. God is sovereign, and the choice is his. How can you silence whom God has called? The first church in Europe was formed through a gathering of women, led by a woman, Lydia. Why? Because she worshiped God, and the Lord opened her heart. So instead of asking where were the men, we should ask, where is God moving? Patriarchy and misogyny aren't God's structures. The Trinity is not a hierarchy. These systems have no place in the church. Any system that subverts a human and takes away their dignity is not of God's heart. So women, this morning, if you have experienced abuse, silencing, subjection, your name or your honor taken from you, I humbly ask you to stand this morning. As I tell my kids, look at me. As a pastor, and on behalf of the church, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the abuse, the trauma, the identity problems, the pain, the waste of time in recovery, wondering who you are. what your name is or who you were called to be. It was not okay. And I'm sorry. And if it's okay with you, I would like to pray over you.